Okay, so we have to be kind of careful when we're talking. So let's not. So what I'm trying to basically caution here is when Plantinga says that it's possible, he doesn't mean epistemically possible. He means modally possible, and this notion is very crucial. Do not confuse it with epistemic possibility. It's modal possibility. That something exists in a possible world, that it represents a coherent possibility. Okay? So, anyway, the reason I'm going to basically argue that Plantinga does in fact beg the question here. Okay, and this becomes very clear if we formalize the argument. If we take the English prose and translate it into a symbolic S5 apparatus, and it becomes inordinately clear how Plantinga begs the question. And this is what I do. 9. If it's possible that a being exemplifies maximal greatness, it's possible that a being exemplifies... I'm misreading myself. Okay, I'll start again. 9, premise. I'll basically read the symbols and then go from there. Possibly necessary G. Okay, and in English, as I translated there, if it's possible that it's necessary that a being exemplifies maximal excellence. In other words, it's possibly necessary that maximal excellence is exemplified, or in other words still, it's possible that maximal greatness is exemplified, since maximal greatness is nothing more than necessary maximal excellence. So if we take necessarily G, that's nothing more than maximal greatness. Okay, so saying possibly maximal greatness is exemplified is nothing more to say than possibly necessarily G. Okay, then 10. Possibly necessarily P implies necessarily P. That's 10. And as I translate, if a proposition P is possibly necessary, then that proposition P is necessary. Okay, that's another S5 axiom. And it's pretty intuitive too, as I explained. Okay, if it's true in a possible world that some proposition X is necessary, then of course, since it's necessary, it's true in that possible world, in every other possible world, it follows that it holds, because it's necessary. Therefore, that proposition, since it holds in all possible worlds, is necessary. So it follows intuitively. I mean, if it's true in a possible world, for instance, say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, okay, and it's true in that possible world, let's call that world W. Okay, at W, alright, it's true that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is necessary. Alright? Since it's necessary, okay, then it follows that it's also true in other possible worlds that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And therefore, that proposition is necessary. I mean, since it's true in that possible world that is necessary, it also follows that it's true in all possible worlds that is true, and hence necessary. Okay, so 10 is just an uncontroversial S5 axiom. Alright, so nothing big here. Only big thing that we're going to see so far is 9, which I'm going to reveal in a moment, why it is question begging. Then 11, necessarily G. It's necessary that maximal excellence is exemplified. In other words, i.e., maximal greatness is exemplified. Okay. Consequent, conditional, mixed it up. Conditional, antecedent, consequent. Okay. Simple modus ponens. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Okay. So 9 through 11, 9 and 10 entail 11. Okay. So, there's nothing big about that yet either. Okay, and then 12 is an uncontroversial S5 axiom. If a proposition P is necessary, then a proposition P is true. Necessarily P implies P. Okay? So, and this is, of course, just simply true. It's kind of obvious. It's intuitively true, and it's an axiom. If something is necessary, if and only if it's true in all possible worlds, and since the actual world is a member of all possible worlds, it follows that it's true in the actual world, and therefore it's true, because it's true in the actual world, and whatever's true in the actual world is true. Okay, so uncontroversial. Then it gets the interesting conclusion, G. It's true that maximal excellence is exemplified. Now, the crucial premise here is 9. It's possibly necessarily G. Okay? And prima facie, it looks modest, right? I mean, after all, the general idea offered is, hey, it's not impossible. I mean, I find nothing impossible about there being a necessary God. Therefore, such a God is possible. There's no incoherence here. And I'm going to detail that in a moment. Anyway, this is all appearance. Okay. As 10 explicates, it's true under S5 and possible world semantics, and to abbreviate, I'm going to say PWS. Okay, so it's true under S5 and PWS. Possibly necessary propositions entail the necessity of that proposition. However, here is the interesting thing. The entailment runs the other way too, and this is bad for his argument. Under S5 and PWS, 14 holds. Necessarily P implies possibly necessary P. In other words, if a proposition P is necessary, then it's possible that P is necessary. And the reason why it holds is because of 15, which is an S5 axiom. Notice that 14 is an S5 theorem, because 14 is a theorem because it's entailed by the axiom 15. If P, therefore P implies possibly P. If a proposition is true, then a proposition is possible. And this is intuitively true as well, since in the actual world is true in if a proposition P is true, then it follows it is true in the actual world. The actual world is a member of all possible worlds. Therefore, P is true in a possible world. Therefore, P is possible. Okay. Alright. Now, given 10 and 14, 16 follows. Okay. Possibly necessarily P, if and only if necessarily P. Basically, if it's possibly necessarily that P is true, if and only if P is necessary. I'm sorry. It's possible that P is necessary if and only if P is necessary. In other words, given 9, 11, and 16, it follows simply that 17, possibly necessarily G, if and only if necessarily G. Okay, in other words, if it's possible, it's possible that G, that maximal excellence is exemplified, is necessary, if and only if maximal excellence being exemplified is necessary. In other words, it's possible that maximal greatness is exemplified if and only if maximal greatness is exemplified. What I mean to say basically is that 9 and 11 are logically equivalent and different ways of expressing the same fact. Okay? Both express the necessity of the exemplification of maximal excellence, or in other words, the exemplification here of maximal greatness. Plainly, if in a possible world there's a necessary entity, then obviously enough there's actually a necessary entity, and vice versa. Or, more formally, if a proposition P entails Q, which entails R, then by transitivity, or by substitution, P entails R. Hence, if P entails Q, and Q entails P, then P entails P. Okay, so we only need to reduce the syllogism to the assertion of P. In other words, P is simply justifying itself here in the argument. So Plantinga can simply reduce this argument to 11, 12, and 13. Necessarily G, necessarily P implies P and G. Okay? God's necessary. Whatever's necessary is actual, therefore God is actual. But this carries no persuasive force because it simply begs the question here. Now he has to show that it's necessary that a being exemplifies maximal excellence. But why grant that? That just simply begs the question against the atheist who denies God's existence and therefore his necessity. You can't simply say that God's necessary to prove his existence. You have to show that God is actually necessary. If a necessary God is actual, then it's obviously necessary. But if a necessary God is necessary, it's trivially actual. Okay, so it's like trying to justify, in other words, the premises entail the conclusion, and the conclusion entails the premises. So the conclusion really just justifies itself. Okay, so it's like we're arguing in a complete circle here. Alright, so assuming God's necessity simply presumes his actuality. Alright, and also necessity isn't acquired by fiat. You can't simply say, you know what, X is necessary.